Joining me now, Aliza Astrow, political analyst for Third Way and author of the report released today titled, How Does Education Level Impact Attitudes Among Voters of Color? And the Reverend Al Sharpton, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation and president of the National Action Network. He's also the author of the new book, Righteous Troublemakers, Untold Stories of the Social Justice Movement in America. Thank you both for coming to the Sunday show. Aliza, let me start with you. What are some differences we see with black voters who went to college and black voters who did not?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So in my report, I looked at a number of different issues. I looked at social and cultural issues and then a number of economic issues like raising the minimum wage. And my report found that on a lot of social and cultural issues, black non-college voters espouse more conservative views than their college-educated counterparts. And then on some issues, there weren't significant education divides, like on some economic issues. So I think it's really important to study those differences and figure out where black voters are divided along educational lines.
And, you know, Aliza, one of the takeaways from your report is that, and I'm quoting here, while this data showed significant divides on many issues, a few key areas of consensus, such as on police reform, point to a path forward for Democrats on tough issues. How so?
Yeah, so the questionnaire that I was looking at asks about reducing, it asks first about reducing funding by 10% for police. For police departments, and then it also asks about a number of reform options, and like banning chokeholds or a number of different reform options. And so we're creating a registry of police who have been investigated for misconduct. And the reform options are incredibly popular across educational divides, and there were not significant educational divides among black voters on those issues. And I also looked at Latino and Asian and white voters, and those reforms were really popular with them as well. And so while defund or decreasing funding for police was not particularly popular with a number of, with black voters and with all voter groups, those reform options were really popular.
One more question for you, Aliza, and then Rev, I'm going to come to you. Talk about the data that you used, because part of the problem of trying to understand voters of color is that the data sets can be super small to begin with, but then when it comes to particular issues, they're even smaller. So talk about the data you used. It's like 66,000 people. Did I have that right? Yes,
you got it. So Harvard University does a study every presidential election year called the Cooperative Election Study, which is a really massive survey of 66,000 Americans. And so most surveys have much smaller sample sizes, and it means that you can't break out voters of color by education or by different demographic groups within race, and sometimes they're even just lumped together as voters of color, which, as we know, voters of color are not a monolith, and that's not really an accurate way to be looking at very different voter groups. And so this study was a very useful resource, because it really does allow you to break out black voters by educational divides.
So, Rev, to my mind, as I said in the intro, Mayor Adams is the embodiment, I think, of Aliza's report for Third Way. Do you agree? And how is his coalition different than the one that put David Dinkins, New York City's first black mayor, into office about 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago?
Well, I think that her study reflects exactly what Eric Adams tapped into. Let's just deal with just personal history. When I started National Action Network 30 years ago, we had to have 5 people to sign for incorporation papers to formally make it an organization, a civil rights social justice organization. One of the 5 was a black cop named Eric Adams, who was part of our movement about police reform, about racial justice with Howard Beach and other incidents of racial violence at that time, but was a police officer. And I think that many people, both in the conservative and in the liberal silos of politics, misread the black community, that you can be moderate in some things and so-called progressive in others. And what we have always wanted was the freedom to be like everyone else, stand up for our interests. So a lot of the crowd that call themselves progressive don't understand they may speak to some issues that the majority of blacks agree with, but in other areas they don't. We're not any more monolithic than anyone else. And I think that a lot of what is misunderstood is we did not want to go from being dictated to by Republicans to being dictated to by those that call themselves progressive. We wanted to be able to speak to our interests. We are the disproportionate victims of police misconduct and gun violence. So we need to have a balance of fighting crime and fighting for police reform at the same time. That is what Eric Adams tapped into, and I think that's where the majority of the black community is nationally now.
And just to put a fine point on it, Rev, you call those folks latte liberals. I want to get your reaction to something else Christina Greer wrote in that New York Times column. She writes, Mr. Adams is in many ways the opposite of the city's first black mayor, David Dinkins, who won the mayoralty in 1989 thanks to his, quote, gorgeous mosaic, a diverse and relatively elite citywide coalition. Mr. Adams built a diverse coalition throughout the 5 boroughs, too, but it was slightly more ethnic and less affluent.
I think that Christina Greer is correct. You know, in '89 was when I was first starting to get my legs as an activist, and I knew Dave Dinkins. Dave Dinkins had been a lawyer for my youth group. But Dave Dinkins came out of the political black establishment. They called it Gang of Four. The Congressman Rangel, Percy Sutton was the Manhattan Borough president for years, as well as Basil Patterson, outstanding lawyer. Eric Adams did not come out of the black elite. One of the reasons that he and I got together is because we were not born in the elite circles and was able to make a mark. And I think he patched together a coalition in a divided time. Let's not forget that Eric Adams came after the Trump presidency. New Yorkers knew Trump better than anybody. He came after we dealt with the devastation of George Floyd and the pandemic. So it was a time for a new model. It was a time to bring broken pieces together to create a new kind of political paradigm. And I think he did it unlike '89, where it was more clear and it was anointed from those that were black empowered as well as established. This was taking broken pieces and putting it together. And I think Eric did that.
You know, Aliza, let me bring you back in here, because one of the things you point out, I think you talked about this earlier, is that how non-college educated voters across demographics tend to be more conservative than college educated. And as we see here on the screen, if you look there among black voters, black non-college educated voters, 15.76%, that is more than, say, college-educated black voters, 12%. Was that something that surprised you, that that the conservatism of non-college educated voters across demographics is consistent or seemingly consistent?
It didn't surprise me, because I think that, you know, we know that that's the case. We know that non-college voters or working class voters tend to be more conservative, and that there is a lot of ideological diversity among voters of color. And so I think that that shouldn't come as a surprise to people, that there is ideological diversity among black voters. And so I think that it's just really important to remember that. And if you are surprised by that data point, then maybe you're treating these voters as more of a monolith than you should be.
Oh, no, that is absolutely correct. And that's why I was thrilled to see your report, Aliza, because, you know, finally it seemed like, oh, here is a report that puts voters of color, but black voters in particular, shows that there is some nuance here, and that it's not, black voters aren't one or the other. Black voters have, you know, nuanced and complex identities and views and ideologies, much in the same way that Reverend Sharpton was talking about. I have run out of time. I have to let you go. Reverend Al Sharpton, thank you very much, as always, for coming to the Sunday show. Aliza Astrow of Third Way, thank you very, very much for coming to the Sunday show and sharing your findings of that new report.